Next topic is valves. So essentially, valves are mechanisms in the world that stop us from going back to previous areas. And the reason why we tend to valves, one of the main things is engine constraints. So we want to unload areas that are behind us, and so that we can have room in memory for things that are in the future. A lot of times there's narrative requirements. So things like, does it make a whole lot of sense for the player to actually retreat back into the previous space? Or do we want the player to just kind of move on ahead? Say there's, characters you don't want the player to interact with because you've sort of, as the player, resolved to move forward, that sort of thing. There's a lot of narrative requirements that we want to sort of keep the player moving forward. Third, and this is kind of a big one, is combat pressure. So I've seen a lot of sort of level pitches because it's very hard to avoid sometimes, but this idea of having a goal space like this and the player sort of is in their exploration mode and they see this goal space and they see the enemies down here. And from this like elevated position, they need to eventually get down there and fight these enemies. But from here, they can actually jump up and shoot at or pop up and shoot at the enemies. And the enemies don't really have a great way of counteracting this. So you're going to end up in that really boring situation of just firing back and forth. Not only that, but you're also going to have to deal with the fact that once the player eventually makes their way down into this space, that the enemies need to be in the appropriate state where they are expecting the player. It opens up a sort of a big can of worms of like, how do I make it so that this actually feels realistic and fun? Because it definitely isn't fun sort of shooting back and forth here. So in a lot of Naughty Dog games, for instance, we try to valve you right as you're sort of going into a combat setup. So here is a alternate to this where here, and this isn't perfect, but maybe you come here, drop down. Once you drop down, then we actually spawn the enemies in, and now you're sort of trapped in this space with the enemies. And so now there's a lot of pressure at your back that keeps you in the space and keeps you dealing with the enemies so that they now have a way of really directly interacting with you. So that is combat pressure. Next we have problem solution focus. So say you have a puzzle space somewhere they need to sort of figure out some sort of problem solution sort of thing. A lot of times you want to valve the player into a space like that so they're not looking for solutions that are outside of the puzzle that you've constructed for them. You want them to sort of focus on the task at hand, so it's good to sort of valve the player in so they understand they're in a problem-solving space and that they understand all of the affordances at their fingertips, I guess. And then lastly, and this kind of goes with narrative requirements, that sometimes we just want to maintain forward momentum so the player isn't sort of getting stuck in previous areas and stuff like that. So let's see. So examples of valves. Obviously, the first one is the example I gave, which was the drop down. It's that these come in a infinite number of variety, and this is probably the easiest one to do. Is you drop down and now you can't get back. Next is, this requires sort of more of an animated object, but the idea of an auto-closed door. Maybe it's a garage door you lift up, and then when you go through, it drops down behind you. We do this often in some of our games. Environmental breakage. There's something that breaks, and now you're at a lower place, or maybe it fell and blocked your pathway backwards, so now you can't go back that way. Or maybe there's a reason the player barricades the door. Maybe there's a lot of enemies chasing you or something like that, and you go through a door, and as soon as you go through, the player has a quick animation where they barricade the door, they put something in front of it, that sort of thing, and now they're not going to move it for the player. Maybe there's an ally cooperative moment. So maybe it takes the ally allies' help in order to move a beam or something like that in order to get us into this new space. And once we're in that new space, they're not going to cooperate because we know from the context that it's time to move forward. There's no reason to go back. And that could be the same thing with like an ally open door. Maybe they have the key to the door and you don't, and they just opened it for you. Or the enemy traps you. Maybe you go into a new space and the enemy drops the door and ambushes you, and now you can't sort of escape. And then lastly is maybe there's a cinematic, and so the cinematic is you come through a door and it closes behind you, and as long as you have enough sort of occupying your time and your focus, you'll forget about the fact that the door just kind of snaps shut behind you, and there's not really any reason why you can't open it, but there's not really any purpose for you going back. So speaking of cinematics, that's one last thing I want to get to is